times since the Bush administration. But the decrease is not exactly good news for undocumented workers. With 1.9 million deportations so far, President Obama is on track to preside over more deportations than any previous administration. Numbers many of the president's political opponents on the right continue to say are not enough. In a detailed account of the real-life consequences of the country's deportation obsession, BuzzFeed's John Stanton spent 13 days documenting how poverty, disease, and the drug trade often greet workers who are sent from the United States back to Mexican border towns. Stanton writes, "If illegal immigration is a tidal wave of humanity, then deportation is the riptide, tearing drug dealers, day laborers, restaurant managers, cousins, and mothers from the roots they've laid down in the U.S. and washing them back." Or as one immigrant described life on the border, "I'm afraid to be here because of my kids, because of all that has happened. Because I am alone, I am afraid to be here, but I have no other options. I have no one else." But when it comes to the nation's on-again, off-again dance with immigration reform, there may finally be some hopeful signals. In his year-end press conference on Friday, the president was bullish on prospects for reform.
We can get immigration reform done. We've got a concept that has bipartisan support. Let's see if we can break through the politics on this.
Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid had an even bolder prediction, telling The Hill this weekend, "I think John Boehner will conference with the Senate. Why wouldn't he? He'll have a lot of pressure from his members now that the election is getting closer." Why wouldn't he is, of course, the question immigration advocates have been asking all year. But for once, they may have some real reason for hope. As Republican Tom Cole said, "We just saw a budget deal that made progress that brought people together from both sides from very different perspectives. And I suspect that can be done on immigration as well." And if Republicans need an example of how reform can get done, they need look no further than New Jersey, where Governor and potential 2016 presidential candidate Chris Christie signed a state version of the DREAM Act on Thursday, allowing undocumented workers to qualify for in-state tuition rates at public colleges. And joining us now from D.C. is Washington Bureau Chief for BuzzFeed, John Stanton. John, thanks for being here.
It's good to be here.
So describe for us just what are the dangers that face people who wind up being pushed back on the other side of the U.S. border?
Well, you know, particularly in places like Tijuana or Nogales and Juarez, pretty much every possible facet of their life is a difficulty. Because they don't have ID or other kinds of identification, it's very difficult for them to get a job. They can't secure housing. The state doesn't do much to help them get back on their feet. And so they are preyed upon by gangs, by the cartels to use as either drug mules or prostitutes. They can't find places to live. In Tijuana, many end up in an area called El Bordo, which is essentially a giant sewage ditch. And they even have difficulties in getting money from their family because they don't have identification. If they're trying to get, say, money wired to them to take a bus someplace, they have to find someone who has ID to go into a bank to get the money. And oftentimes those people just take the money or charge exorbitant amounts of a finder's fee, essentially. And so every part of their life is essentially a danger.
And John, and yet the political imperatives continue to be on border security. There doesn't seem to be much traction, at least in the House, to move on the Senate's reforms. But I want to ask you about those Senate reforms. So the Senate bill, what they've proposed is this 13-year pathway to citizenship. It would increase the spending an additional $46 billion on border security. It would have mandatory workplace verification for employers, new visa programs for low-skilled workers. So I ask you, with the government already spending, the federal government already spending, poised to spend $12 billion on customs and border enforcement to put people in exactly the situation that you've described in your piece, would reform even help?
It would certainly have a short-term help. When those people, when the 11 million undocumented people in the United States are put on the legalized path, then they would not get deported. So you, I think, would probably see a short-term cessation or at least slowing down of deportations to places like Tijuana. But in the end, you're right, it's going to come back. You know, illegal immigration is never going to be stopped. When you go to the border, you can see it with your own eyes that the fence doesn't actually extend along the border. There are plenty of spaces where the people can just walk across, and really the fence doesn't do that much to end illegal deportation. People will find a way to get into the country. They are coming from oftentimes absolutely horrible conditions in southern Mexico and in other states in Latin America, and they feel that they have to do this no matter what the risks or challenges we might throw up. And so I do think that, in a few years, you're going to be back in a situation where you're going to be having thousands of people being deported again to border towns.
And, I want to come back to just to ask Robert this question. I mean, for Republicans, it has been difficult to move on the immigration issue for obvious reasons. There's not a lot of support for it for a lot of Republicans in their base, particularly in the House, right, with primaries still coming up. Do you see the prospects for stories like this moving some members on the House to at least allow John Boehner to bring the Senate bill up?
I think it's... John Boehner is not going to bring up the Senate bill. What you're going to see Republicans do likely in 2014 is do some kind of piecemeal reform from Republican version of the DREAM Act. And anything more than that is really going to be a long shot, because John Boehner, as Speaker, has very limited political capital right now with the Republican conference. Conservatives are already wary of Boehner. And the way he went after the Tea Party on the budget deal, now if he's going to try to get them to come on board on immigration, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, and talking about on the state level, John, on this idea that the states maybe can start to solve this problem themselves. Chris Christie, obviously potentially running for president, did this deal on but the last guy who did that was a guy named Rick Perry. And I just want to play some sound of Rick Perry from one of the Republican debates and just looking at the response that he got, if we could play that sound.
If you say that we should not educate children who have come into our state for no other reason than they've been brought there by no fault of their own, I don't think you have a heart. This was a state issue. Texans voted on it, and I still support it greatly.
Senator Santorum.
You heard the boos there, John. I mean, so the idea that this is not just a problem that's thorny at the federal level is just not true. Even at the state level, governors like Christie or like like Rick Perry face a huge backlash if they try to change this as well.
No, you're right. And, governors are handling this in a variety of ways. In Arizona, they're taking a very hard line on immigration, whereas in places like Texas and other states, they've tried to find a middle ground. And, at the state level, these same kinds of fights are going on, and sometimes in a much more sort of divisive manner. In Congress, I think a vast majority of people believe that something needs to be done. What that is the question. But at the state level, in a lot of state houses, people, the only thing they really want to do in some cases is try to crack down harder on illegal immigrants and not find a way to either bring them in or end the problem as a whole, or find some way to make it a less of a difficulty for people. And
John,
it is.
And John, when you go and talk to the people that were in these border, people that are in these situations, are there advocacy groups that have standing in Washington? Are there people down there trying to organize, at least to get these stories out and get them in front of lawmakers in Washington or at the state level to try to make a difference?
Not very much, to be honest. The Jesuits are one of the biggest groups probably working along the border with deportees. There are some doctors that work in some places, and just sort of regular folks in these border towns. But the problem for the deportees is that once they leave the United States, as far as the United States is concerned, the government and the population, they're no longer our problem. And for the Mexican government, they don't want the problem. They don't really have the resources to deal with it. And so they try to ignore it to a certain degree. And really they are, as one doctor called them, invisible people. They no longer have a state to call their own, really.
And so if we're now not having a great deal of hope at the state level, not having a great deal of hope at the congressional level, we have seen the president do a lot more through executive action, including on immigration. Is there rumblings that there may be even further executive action, and can the president do much about this problem just through his own executive authority?
Well, he did take some actions on Dreamers, for instance, and activists have now started to make the case that those same kinds of executive reforms should be applied more broadly to all people that are in the country, so that there are no longer any more deportations. The president has resisted that fairly strongly, and I would be surprised if they go very far on that. But the pressure is becoming harder and harder. Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi has come out recently and argued that they need to slow down or stop deportations, so we could see something like that.
All right, well, we can only hope. BuzzFeed's John Stanton, thank you for your great reporting.